Today we're going to take up the third of four parts of the STAAR PowerPoint, Chapter 9. This is from Jarrett, Chapter 9, America and World War I. And as I said before, this is the STAAR PowerPoint. And this is number 3 of 4. And so let us continue. Let's go to our next slide, and we can see right here there is a little bit of a picture of American soldiers probably coming out of, it looks like coming out of a trench, attacking a German position. And as you can see in the title right there, America declares war, America declares war, World War I, right in there. And I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but it does look like, again, they're coming out of a trench right over here. So let us move forward to our next slide. We only have about 7 or 8 slides, I believe, on this particular PowerPoint. And my iPad is working a little slowly, so if I take a few moments to pause, it's because I'm having a little trouble going from slide to slide. And here we are. The home front. We have discussed this numerous times before, and we've seen some video and hopefully some PowerPoints by the time you've seen this. But again, America was only in the war for a short period of time, from April of 1917 till November of 1918. And not really a very long period of time. The war itself, of course, started in 1914, but again, we did not get involved until 1917. So it is a short war for us, but a lot of things that were happening, very important things that did affect America for generations to come. Let's take a few moments to look at some of those. To fight the war, President Wilson, again, we talked about his election in 1916, running on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," and just a short time after he was inaugurated for a second term, we were at war. And of course, this is due to the Zimmerman telegram, the seeking of Lusitania, the breaking of the Sussex Pledge by the Germans, the unrestricted the unrestricted submarine warfare conducted by the Germans. These are all reasons why we got into the war. And so once we got into the war, President Wilson was given wide powers by Congress to run and win the war. Because the military was relatively small for that period of time, to solve the problem of a lack of military, Congress passed the Secret Service Act, which is the draft, and eventually about 3 million men were in uniform. Now, there were some women as well. They were not really in the military as we perceive it today. There were auxiliary units for women, but getting back to the point, about 3 million men got into uniform. At one time or another, there were a large number of African Americans who did serve, but because of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case of the 1890s, basically saying that separate but equal is constitutional, because of Plessy, the African Americans served in segregated units. Now, many did serve in World War I. Some of them served in American units. There were many who served in French units. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And here we see in the bottom right-hand corner a very familiar picture. We Can Do It. This refers to, of course, the Rosie the Riveter, though this is really more World War II than World War I. The image indicates that women could serve in certain roles, could do certain things that they had traditionally been left out of prior to this point. And we're continuing with the home front from 1917 to 1918. Women and African Americans would play a vital role in the war because millions of men had left their jobs to fight in the war. Again, we put in around 3 million men into uniform, and most of those men were young men, 18 to 35 or so, which of course is the period of time when men start to work, men marry, start to have children, and so for a period of time, let's just focus on the job at the moment, those jobs were left unfilled. And so who would now fill them? Well, women and African Americans would now take a larger role in the American economy than ever before. Women would take the place of their husbands, their fathers, their brothers who had gone to serve in the military. African Americans left the South in large numbers in what we often refer to as the Great Migration. They went north looking for jobs, again, to take the place of white men who had joined the military. Again, even though we had 100,000 plus blacks who served in the military, that number is kind of pale in comparison to the number of white men who joined or who were drafted. Anyway, the jobs that were left vacant, many of them were filled by either immigrants or African Americans. So these relatively two underrepresented groups in American economy, women and African Americans, now serve a much larger role than ever before. African Americans were not allowed to fight in the AEF, and of course the AEF is the American Expeditionary Force, but did serve under some French leaders, did serve with the French. Now, we're going to leave that statement as it is. I believe there were some, that just maybe slightly off. I believe there were some blacks who served in the American military who did fight. If there were not many. But most of the blacks, I do believe, who served and fought in the military usually fought under French control. The efforts of the women in the workforce helped them gain support for suffrage. Universal suffrage, the 19th Amendment, that comes to be, that is passed a year or so after the war ends, in large part due to the efforts women put forth in World War I, during World War I, as they took the place again of their brothers, their fathers, their husbands, in the economy, doing the jobs that those men had been doing before. Let us continue with the home front in 1917 and 1918. We have a picture there in the bottom right-hand corner of a supposedly attractive young woman. Okay, you've got a date with not a blonde, but with a bond. And this was trying to sell war bonds in order to raise money to help finance the war. Again, we're looking at 1917, 1918, the home front. About 2 million men would serve in Europe, and we put almost 3 million men in uniform, so about 2/3 of them went to Europe. Not all of them would see combat, of course, because we were only in the war for a relatively short period of time. But the cost of the war was about $30 billion, which was a tremendous sum of money at that time. If you were to take it and to equate it to today's dollars, I can't really give you an exact number, but keep in mind this is about 1918. In 1929 or so, at the time of J.D. Rockefeller's death, his $900 million, which was his fortune, the amount of money he is credited with having at the time of his death, that $900 million is approximately worth about $500 billion today, which would make him the richest man of all time. So we go back a few years and we take 900 million and make it 30 billion. Well, we're probably looking at trillions of dollars. You know, if I get a chance, I'll see if I can find some website or someone who can transfer that for me and give you a better idea. But let's just go with, it's a staggering sum. And how was this paid for? Move that line there a little bit. How was this paid for? Well, we increased taxes, which is a common way, and the sale of war bonds. Okay, and how do we sell war bonds? Well, we sold it by propaganda, by images, by campaigns like this. Speaking of propaganda, it would play an important role in the war. And if you have not seen, you will see before we finish this chapter several examples of some of that propaganda. Posters depicting the Germans as brutal beasts. Posters depicting the Germans as child rapists. The kind of things that today many of us see all the time. Facebook, someplace on the internet, stories in magazines, so forth and so on, and we kind of, okay, that's just the way the world is. But in the period of time we're discussing, the late 19 teens, that kind of propaganda hit home with a lot of people. And of course, it turned many people against the Germans who may have been somewhat ambivalent, who were, I don't really care. But now, because of the propaganda and the large role it would play, they were now very much on board with the war against the Germans. All resources were mobilized into the conflict, and it turned the conflict into a total war. Every aspect of the economy, every aspect of American life was geared toward winning the war. That is total war. And we've seen a few of the things mentioned already. And the economy was handed over to the government essentially. The government created a number of different agencies, and their job was to make the economy more efficient, to allocate resources that would enable us to win the war. People voluntarily rationed themselves, stopped buying certain things because those items, gasoline for example, even though cars were not all that popular at this time, but food, probably a better example at this time. Food was rationed. People started growing their own food in their backyard. Small amounts of corn or tomatoes or whatever to save food to be sending over to our troops and our allies in Europe. Let's continue. We only have a couple more slides left in this presentation. The home front, again, we're continuing with this theme. That is the theme of the third part of this video. The home front, 1917 through 1918. I have a couple images here at the bottom. The one on the bottom right, as you can see, Uncle Sam, and you can tell it's Uncle Sam because of the red, white, and blue, or you can assume it's Uncle Sam. And he's telling this person to be quiet. Criticism of society is not free speech. Now again, as we talked about, I believe it was the last slide or slide before, the Congress gave the president tremendous power, and this is not uncommon. During this war, again, we're still looking at the home front. During this war, any war really, civil liberties are often violated to meet wartime needs. For example, Abraham Lincoln suspended the concept of habeas corpus during the Civil War. He also shut down a number of newspapers who were critical of the North's war effort, and in particular, his efforts as commander-in-chief. So, this is not the first time it occurred. It has happened before. In the bottom left, over here, we see a couple of young ladies, maybe not young, but we see a couple of ladies. Mr. President, remember the Constitution. Congress shall make no law addressing the freedom of speech or of the press, and then that's in quotations, the political, oh gosh, I can't read that. Whatever it is. The political, hopefully someone can read that, who believed in this guarantee are now serving. Oh yeah, okay. I get it now. The political prisoners, there we go, political prisoners who believed in this guarantee, the guarantee of free speech, are now serving 20 years in prison. I'm sorry it took me so long, but it's difficult to read that. I probably should have written it down before I got to this slide. And so what they're basically saying, people who believed in free speech, as we are guaranteed in the First Amendment, were being arrested and put in jail. And we see about 6,000 Americans who were arrested under the Espionage Act, which was enacted in 1917. Again, the first year that we joined the war. And the Espionage Act made it a crime to criticize the war. Okay? Just like Lincoln had attempted to stop criticism of him in his efforts as commander-in-chief during the Civil War, just as John Adams had made an attempt in his presidency from 1796 to 1800 to shut down dissent, to shut down criticism of him. It was called the Sedition Act under Adams. Anyway, it is not uncommon for presidents to attempt to do this, to shut down people who criticize them at the time of the war. And let's not kid ourselves. President Obama has done the same thing numerous times. He has criticized Fox News, for example, which is really the only of the major media outlets that is at least a least bit critical of him. He's called it not a news organization. He's made fun of it and belittled it, as he has done with numerous of his political opponents. Not exactly the Espionage Act. I mean, it's not like Fox News broadcasters are going to jail or being arrested and going to jail, but it is an attempt to silence, to marginalize your political opponents. Now, the Espionage Act violated American civil rights, like the First Amendment, which of course is the amendment that goes into free speech. So here we have in the bottom left an example of that, and then we have here, the bottom right and the bottom left, examples of freedom of speech being violated by the president in order to win the war. All right. We have a couple of more slides, I think about 3 more slides. Next two, we'll look at some of the heroes of the war, and we have here in the bottom right-hand corner a picture of General John Blackjack Pershing. He is one of the 2 heroes that we'll be taking a look at. Pershing was selected to lead the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. We've already discussed him prior. He, of course, was the man who was selected to lead the army in search of Pancho Villa. I believe that was in 1914. He also served, not with Teddy Roosevelt, but he did serve in the Spanish-American War, and he fought at San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt. So he does have a long war record. He was, as it states in the 3rd bullet, a decorated war hero. And he refused. Now again, this is a kind of a neat part of him and his beliefs. He refused to send American troops into battle until they were well trained. He wanted to make sure his troops were the best trained, best outfitted, best equipped army they could be. And of course, with American resources, that meant they were well trained and equipped. He believed this would lead to fewer deaths, which of course then won him the love and respect of his men, because Pershing put his troops ahead of his own personal goals, his own personal agenda. And let's face it, in today's political environment, that is not often occurring. We go to our next hero of the war. We're going to be looking at Alvin York. And there's a picture of Sergeant York at the bottom of the page there in the right-hand corner, right there. Here's an image of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Alvin York was a Tennessean. He represented the typical draftee of World War I. He was underprivileged and undereducated. In the Battle of the Argonne Forest, which of course is the most important, the best well-known battle of the entire war, Sergeant York is credited with single-handedly killing 25 Germans and capturing 132 prisoners. Now these numbers are, astronomical. These numbers are difficult to believe. And I believe we have discussed in previous videos how we went about doing that, so I'm not going to go into it right this moment. But because of his bravery, his heroism, his gallantry in the face of the enemy, he was given the Congressional Medal of Honor. The highest honor we have to give to our soldiers. In addition to that, he was given pretty much every other award that we have to give to soldiers, and given every award that pretty much every other Allied country had to bestow upon soldiers. To this date, when this PowerPoint was made, there have been 3,499 soldiers who have been given, clean that up a little bit, sorry. Congressional Medal has been given to about 3,500 soldiers. And of course, this is a relatively small number when you compare it to the number of men and women who have served in combat, who have served in the military. We have had millions, tens of millions of men, women, who have served in combat, and probably double to triple or more men who have served and women who have served in the military. But of those millions and millions and millions of men and women who have served, we've given out less than 3,500 Congressional Medals of Honor. Therefore, it is a prestigious award that's not given out just to anyone. I believe this is our final slide, the Battle of the Argonne Forest. The greatest battle of the war was fought in the Argonne Forest, which is on the northeastern part of France. Part of it borders on the French-German boundary, and part of it is on the French-Belgium boundary. Germany had spent years fortifying this hilly, forested area. They had surrounded it with barbed wire. They had placed landmines, concrete bunkers, tanks and machine guns as part of this fortification. So for several years, and again, we don't get into the war until 1917, and the war took place toward the end of the war, which ended in November of 1918. So for a couple of years, the Germans had spent fortifying this forested area. They had been placing in key critical positions to the German mind, barbed wire, which of course makes it difficult for men to move, landmines, which is of course not only quite deadly for men as they accidentally step on them, but of course tanks as well. Concrete barriers, which made it difficult for tanks to move through because they were too large, too heavy for the tanks to go over. And this, of course, is before tanks became the bigger, stronger, more powerful machines that they are today. They put in some places tanks and would then deal with the infantry moving through the forest, and of course machine guns. So this had all been done for a couple of years leading up to the battle. General Pershing led about 600,000 men into this battle, and against all odds, he succeeded in breaking through the German lines in this is really the last big battle of the war, and most important battle the American Expeditionary Force fought. So really this is the biggest, most important battle that the AEF fought in, and this is really the final battle, really big final battle of the war. Alright, let me double check, and yes, we are done. That was the last slide of this particular presentation. Again, this is the third of 4 presentations of the STAAR PowerPoint. We will have one more. And so, STAAR. This is 3 of 4. And that is it. See you next time.